This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Poldus Project's weekly dispatches series. In India, reckless industrialization, neoliberal economic policies, and poorly enforced environmental laws have led to severe exploitation of the environment and created political unrest by threatening the lives and livelihoods of millions. India has a long history of environmental struggle and often that has often been met with brutal state repression. As environmental crisis worsens at an exponential and catastrophic speed, we face an urgent need to reimagine our societies from ground up. The way we live, our economic and political systems need to be interrogated, questioned, and reimagined. Joining us today to discuss the environmental challenges of the present and the history of environmental activism in India and the state's crushing of dissent and how youth activism has shaped the discourse is Nityanand Jayaraman. Mr. Nityanand Jayaraman is an engineer turned journalist and activist who's Chennai based. He was also a Chennai based writer and a social activist and a member of the Chennai Solidarity Group, a collective that fights environmental justice and discrimination. Nityanand's group has played a critical role in expanding the democratic space for community struggles, including the campaign for justice in Bhopal, the campaign against Unilever's mercury pollution in Kodaikanal, the fisherfolk struggle to save the Ennore wetlands in Chennai, and the protest by residents in Tuticorin against the UK-based multinational Vedanta. Mr. Nityanand, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I want to start with the larger history of environmental activism in India. Can you walk us through the various environmental activism movements in India, but also how various states have responded to this and how you understand environmental activism in India?
So, environmental movements as such, I mean, I think that I wouldn't call them environmental movements. We have social justice movements that work on issues of gender, social justice movements that work on issues of fair wages, and you have social justice movements that work on issues to do with natural resources, access to natural resources, and environment broadly defined could be the environment in which you work, the environment in which your children play, the kind of water you drink, the food that you eat, the air that you breathe, etc. And so, seen from that point of view, the environmental movement as such has largely been in the social context in India. And I think that the early movements, which is post-independence, can be traced back to a continuum of the kinds of conflicts that arose when the British were there, and these were all conflicts against enclosure of lands, because then, as it is now, the fights have been largely about land and about land use, about how land is to be used and who decides how a land is to be used. If the In the colonial days, if the British came over and took over large tracts of forest, which communities thought were theirs to use in a non-exploitative manner, and then privatized it by handing it over to the forest department, that set off a conflict, and that conflict continues till date, because the British colonial or the crown has been replaced by the government of India. So it is just that the villain is now a new villain. Instead of a white empire in London, we now have a brown empire in the form of the government of India or the state governments that want the lands and want to control what happens to these lands. Eminent domain, or the right of the state to take over land, if there is quote unquote public interest involved, and the state gets to define what the public interest is. This is a huge cause of conflict, and that has continued through the ages. So in 1972, Mrs. Gandhi, after having returned from a very important international conference, the Brundtland Commission decided to announce the Wildlife Protection Act, which I think is a very important act. It's an important act because uh, it spotlights the rights of a community that is silent or invisible or not very audible. I mean, we can't hear them, and because these are animals and plants without a voice. But this Wildlife Protection Act also borrowed from the American model, where nature preserves and sanctuaries and national parks were proposed. In the Indian case, you don't have pristine environments. We have environments that have always been worked upon by the hand of men and more so women. And these are areas where culture, nature, nurture tend to mingle. And all of a sudden, you come in and say the hand of human beings will be excluded. There are connections with the land. The connections are in the form of livelihoods, in the form of cultures, in the form of identities, in the form of arts, all of which emanates from land. And this land is being taken away and privatized. It is like taking your child away or taking your mother away. You can define it whichever way, or father away. You can define it whichever way you want. So a lot of conflict arose from the Wildlife Protection Act, even though the Wildlife Protection Act had noble intentions. There was a provision for settlement of rights of the indigenous people. There was not an acknowledgement of rights, it was a settlement of rights, which means you have no option but to give up your rights over your child or your parent or the land that sustains you. No option was given. This caused a lot of conflict. Also, because it was not implemented. The There's a saying in Jharkhand, in central India, that heaven is acres and acres of maua trees. Maua is a very important tree in the culture of the indigenous people of Jharkhand. And so heaven is acres and acres of maua trees, and hell is acres and acres of maua trees with one forest guard roaming around, because the forest department had all of a sudden become the biggest villain for ordinary people. So here we have conservation or forest, the department, the jurisdiction of forest, standing against the interests of ordinary people for whom the forest is not just livelihood, is not just a financial relationship. It is a lot more than that. The second wave also happened with the development, which is the post-colonial development, where India wanted to become self-sufficient. So you had a couple of different ways in which it happened, where large infrastructure in the form of dams and in the form of roads and in the form of big industries were created. We are told that when those things happened, people willingly gave their land. Nobody willingly gives their land. It is it is very difficult to make an Indian part with their land. I would say the same thing holds true for any part of the world. We see the kind of conflicts in North America over the Dakota pipeline or the tar sands pipeline, and we know that there is a lot more. These are not lands that they use on a daily basis, but people do not want to give over those lands because the lands have meaning beyond what the modern economy and Wall Street can understand or comprehend. But that has been another state of another phase of conflict. The third phase of conflict is where the word environment starts coming in, and this begins in the late 80s, in the 80s and the 90s, with an increased awareness of among urban people. The urbanites have always been laggards in terms of understanding what land means. And even now, they haven't made that connection. And this phase is where we had rooted struggles in places like Narmada, in Koel Karo, in various places around India on large dams or large industrial projects, which was being protested by local people, which also drew in support. The Silent Valley project, for instance, was a landmark project on environmental project, but then it had a lot of subscription from ordinary and middle class Indians, a very small middle class at the time in Kerala. And the Silent Valley was a large dam project inside a very important evergreen forest in the Western Ghats. That project was defeated, or I would say that Indira Gandhi decided not to go with that project at the time. But there was a massive movement by people, including scientists and wildlife enthusiasts and poets, one of whom, Sugata Kumari, who died recently. But at the same time, there were other conflicts which were not as successful. And these conflicts involved Adivasi people. There were mines being built. This was fought against decades before keep the coal in the ground became a rallying cry for white environmentalists and environmentalists around the world who are talking about climate change. Indigenous people around the world have been asking for coal to be kept under the ground. There was no subscription by anybody for that rallying cry because it involved land use change that benefited us and harmed somebody else who was either invisible or externalized. And so those struggles were all, and each of these things have been fought even from before British to after the Indian government took over. There have been conflicts around mines of various kinds in various parts of India, against dams, against large industries, etc. Fast forward to 90s is when all hell broke loose because that's when the IMF, World Bank's formula of global reforms and liberalization, globalization, and privatization started, taking center stage in Indian economy. Was ushered in by the Congress government, by Narasimha Rao. This is supposed to be the Achedan of those days. The Achedan of those days were horrendous. They might not have been horrendous for people like me, the beneficiaries, but they were horrendous for the people where the extraction, happened, and so we had a flurry of protests starting from 90s against large dams. The Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is an anti-dam struggle, that was kind of waged against a large number of dams that were constructed on the river Narmada. At the same time, there was also a very important fight against deep sea fishing vessels, which was supposed to go corporate big, fishing vessels that were factory ships that would go in, suck in all the resources from the deep seas, convert it into fish food or into human food in canned and sent over. This was hugely protested by artisanal fishers in India. Even before that, there was a fight against mechanized boats. These are boats that are in the in North America and other places. These boats would be considered artisanal because they're about 11 meters, but they have very destructive fishing gears. They call trawlers or purse seiners, and these things tend to take everything that is there inside the water. There were huge fights in Kerala and Tamil Nadu against these boats, and these boats were introduced as a goodwill gesture by the Norwegian government in India. So you had the Norwegian government coming and offering India an assistance and saying, here's how you can improve the fisheries economy. The fisher people fought against it, not on environmental grounds, on ethical grounds, saying that nobody has the right to take so much. There is just no need to take so much. It was a moral issue, it is an ethical issue, it is not so much an environmental issue because in that time the sea was still considered to be limitless. But even in a limitless sea, you do not take more than what you need. So that's 90s, and also in 90s you had the nuclear testing in Pokhran and the protests against it, asking for India to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There were the protests against nuclear power plants around the country. There was, of course, Gorbachev signing with Rajiv Gandhi the agreement on Kudangulam, which the fight was not as big then as it became in 2011 after Fukushima. So I will just like kind of leave it at that as broad brushstrokes.
Thank you so much for that broad and expansive introduction that kind of really helps us go in depth and delve into some of the other issues we're going to be dealing with. Um, I now want to get into the language of the activism. In an essay in The Wire, you wrote critiquing the ways in which climate change reports are framed. You write that climate change reports view the ecological problem as one of the excess carbon dioxide in the troposphere that allows the global elite to deploy climate mercenaries and tech companies to convert the eco-catastrophic into a trade fair for techno fixes to reduce emissions and capture atmospheric carbon. Tell us about this critique and the alternative approaches to think about environmental sustainability that you recommend, but also perhaps a little bit about the language that we use to still discuss and talk about the reports used to talk about environmental change and climate change.
So it's now about 30 years that I've been in activism, social activism, uh, with probably a predominance of environmental justice, but it's social activism. The key issue in this is that you can't have a successful environmental struggle unless you're fighting patriarchy, unless you're fighting against inequality, unless you're fighting against torture, unless you're fighting for democracy. You have to have a respect, a certain humility. I cannot fight a fight in a silo. I can fight for the rights of the tiger as long as those rights for the tigers also respect the right of the Dalit woman to an equal life on this planet. If that is not there, that is a fight that I will have to fight against. So that is one key thing that I will say as a preface to the existing what is called the climate movement. Um, People. So in the last 30 years that I've been an activist, I've never been a climate activist. I never really engaged in quote unquote climate activism. I don't know what that means because you can't fight climate change. That is something that is out of your hands. Ordinary people don't engage in campaigns against climate change. People who are fighting in Ennore, people who are fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, people who are fighting something else in some other place, part of the world, a mine, are fighting against a mine. They're fighting against a pipeline. They're fighting against land being taken over, land that is sacred to me, land that has meaning. They're fighting against a change of meaning. It so happens that every one of these fights, which have been fought for the last 300, 400 years of modern civilization, also have impacts on the climate. So, when the first mines were to be dug in central India or in East India, the indigenous people over there fought against the mines. The reasons they fought against the mines 300 years ago are the same reasons that they are fighting against the mines today. But now we have an entire bunch of global cheerleaders who are saying this is a climate fight. Yes, it happens to be a climate fight. It was a climate fight 300 years ago. And if solidarity had come for the basics, the understanding of what those people bring is that you destroy the forest for the mineral, then you lose an eternity. What is under the land will be burnt in 30 to 40 years. What is over the land will give you water forever. This is a choice that we keep making. So, in the current climate change discussions, what I find missing is that somehow this issue of climate change can be addressed by switching to renewables, by having solar plants and having wind power, and then having a green economy, and then we have green consumerism, and then we have little green people running everywhere. This is nonsense. Essentially, what we have is a broken economic system that is exploitative of people, that is exploitative of nature. And if your solution does not upset the system, then it is not a solution. So, if the entire climate change or the climate movement does not rock the boat, does not disturb the status quo, does not make Wall Street extremely angry, ensures that it is not practical for them to survive because that is a system that should not survive. There has to be a different kind of a system which is based on non exploitation of nature and of people, celebrating values of cooperation. If you want that kind of a system, that kind of a system would probably celebrate open earth, unpaved, unbuilt infrastructure. What the Sioux community, and I take a lot of inspiration from the indigenous communities around the world because I come from a very privileged background in a city and happen to have chanced upon, despite my education, which I see as a handicap, to be able to relate to people and the planet. I've been lucky enough to have some exposure to the wisdom of what these people are fighting for. And there we find very clearly that the issue is about land use change and not so much about climate change. So I keep coming back to that, that if we cannot understand the logic behind the fights of ordinary people against environment, and then the environmental fight is not always about preserving the environment, it might be about preserving my home. So we have the fights of pavement dwellers, of people living in extremely difficult situations inside cities, and the city wants to beautify, the city wants to gentrify. We see this happening in Rio de Janeiro when there's a FIFA, the football, soccer international tournament happening. We see that happening during the Commonwealth Games in India. In India, we see it when Trump wants to visit Gujarat. That the idea of beautification is to hide what you consider dirty, and dirt is a value-loaded term. What you can, I might consider the Wall Street to be dirty. I want it to be hidden. I want it to be gone. But the world, the dominant forces seem to think that poor people are dirty. They have to be removed. You chuck them like you chuck garbage. That's an environmental justice issue. So a lot of times what you will also find is that there are more people that are actually hurt by what are called solutions than there are people hurt by problems. So what I think is that there are more solution impacted communities in the world than there are problem impacted communities. Dams are a solution. Now, I mean, nuclear power plants are a solution. The Sterlite copper smelter is supposed to be a solution. A highway is supposed to be a solution. A port is supposed to be a solution. But these solutions are hurting people who don't have a voice, who are invisibilized in this mad kind of a rush to finish off everything that is there on this planet.
At this point, I'm just going to let our audience know that we do take live questions, and please send them in. Now I kind of want to go and look at three different case studies. One of it is the Kudangulam issue. Here we had around 9,000 people who were charged under the section of the law, including sedition for peaceful protests against the Kudangulam nuclear power project. Can you tell us about not only the protest movements that have happened, but what these mass filing of these sedition cases meant for silencing of voices, but also how you view this now all of these years later? And then after Kudangulam, you've seen other things now play out. Now mass FIRs have now been normalized. Can you talk to us about that, please?
So mass FIRs are not something that is new, but using it at the scale that they did in Kudangulam was definitely, probably one of the first times that they've done that. The Kudangulam is a small village. Nobody had heard of it. I had not heard of it before the stuff hit the ceiling in 2011 March. And the reason why it happened is something happened in Fukushima in Japan, where a nuclear reactor run by the Japanese exploded and there was a global disaster. The natural question is, if it can happen in Japan and they don't know how to handle it, how the hell are we going to handle something like this in India? And at that time, they happened to be constructing two nuclear power plants in this town called Kudangulam in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, east coast. And this nuclear power plant had drawn opposition even when it was first proposed in 1988. There was an agreement drawn between Gorbachev and the government at the time, government of India at the time. And that agreement, of course, lapsed because Soviet Union lapsed. And it was revived again after Russia came into being. In 2001, construction began over there. There were very feeble protests. So the key thing to also understand is that the lack of protest does not mean acceptance. The lack of protest might mean cynicism, that the government will not listen. The lack of protest might be fear because they're scared to speak out. But the lack of protest doesn't mean a lack of conflict. 2011, this thing breaks out in March 2011. By September 2011, Government of India announces that the reactor will go critical in a month's time, and people start getting freaked out. They gather spontaneously, block the roads. The government is seems to be the government of Tamil Nadu. So the government of Tamil Nadu, the state government, seems quiet and seems to be uncaring. But they were not uncaring. We found out much later. Immediately after that, within a week or so of these protests happening, we also had a very important Muslim and a Hindu festival. And so people suspended the protest out of respect for the people of faith who had to celebrate their festivals. They resumed the protest because the in between the government of Tamil Nadu then invited the people for a discussion, for a dialogue, and told them that we will issue a cabinet resolution that all work on the power plant will stop until people's fears are allayed. The government of India, which was constructing the power plant, did not listen to it and went ahead and declared that they will go critical in a month's time. So people took more assertive steps and blocked the gate of the power plant in October. The government of Tamil Nadu ought to have enforced its cabinet resolution, but for whatever reasons, it chose not to, and it screwed the people over. And from October, there was also supposed to be an election, so people again, at the request of the state government, suspended their protests for a few days, allowed the election to happen, and resumed their protests. And by this time, the state government starts hardening its stance, and in January, it begins showing its real fangs. And between the September and September 2011 and January of 2012, 101 cases were filed against more than 55,000 people. That is about a third of the assembly constituency. So virtually 1 in 3 persons in that particular assembly constituency, electoral constituency, was deemed to be a criminal by this, if this FIR were to be believed, if these cases were to be believed. This went on to ridiculous proportions. In March 2012, the government blockades the entire village, the key villages that were protesting against it, and prevents even milk from reaching the villages, trying to starve them out. I mean, this is like a scorched earth policy that the government of India, this is the independent government of India and the independent government of Tamil Nadu, waging war against people. And these people were accused of waging war against the state. It is quite the opposite. The state was waging war against its people by blocking off supplies. And people had to fend for themselves, which means it was people to people solidarity. So there were fishermen from neighboring villages that brought the milk and even water to some of these villages by boats, by sea. And of course, the police in our state, fortunately, don't swim or ride boats well. And so, the fishermen were able to get this done. The long and short of it is, we had close to 10,000 people who are facing charges of sedition and waging war against the state. And most of these people are unnamed, which means any person from that place can be picked up and implicated in the sedition or waging war case. The idea behind these cases is not to win the case. The minute a case is filed, your punishment begins, because you will have to run to court. You always are scared about the knock on your door. It is meant to intimidate people into submission. And this is something that is not a new one, but the government of India, the independent government of India, sedition was a law that was brought in by the British against brown Indians. The law was used not so frequently. But since independence, the government of India has far surpassed the British in the use of the law and also in brutalizing its people, to a point where it seems as if a number of people probably think that it might have been even a mistake to hand over the reins to these governments. Because in the last so many years, sedition is used. No ordinary charges are filed anymore. You gather on the sides of a street, it is sedition. It is Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. These are detentions without bail, without a hearing.
On the question of waging war against the people, I want to now discuss the case of what happened with the Vedanta Sterlite protests. Um, in May 20, on the 22nd of May in 2018, you had protesters fighting for over 100 days of protests. But what you really saw was the Tamil Nadu State Police then firing with snipers at the protesters. Can you now, I'm assuming that we are assuming that most of our audience are also global. Can you walk us through these protests and the violence that was unleashed?
So, Vedanta is a company with an Indian name, but a company that is based in England. And corporations don't have loyalties to any soil because they are essentially inanimate artifacts of law. They're not objects that have soul that you can appeal to or a body that you can incarcerate. So, Vedanta is a very large multinational mining company dealing with non-ferrous metals. So it is not just India that it mines in. They also had mines in Zambia, which have been shut down, and the Zambian government is taking them to court for a variety of violations. People of Zambia have filed cases against Vedanta for polluting their river, and they've gone to England and even obtained compensation. So Vedanta has operations all over. They decided to locate a controversial copper smelter. And copper smelters are, as a technology, inherently polluting because copper is found in combination with sulfur and with a large number of other metals, all of which are hugely problematic and toxic, like mercury and lead and zinc. And so, when you extract copper from the ore, the laws of physics say that the other metals will also be released or mobilized. And a quote unquote a good smelter will try and contain all these things and trap it in some waste or the other and store the waste in places. Vedanta set up in 1996 amidst intense protests by people, which were again brutally repressed by the state government at the time. And the state government even engineered riots within the state, within the district where the opposition was happening, between communities. And this is another tactic that is used to diffuse issues. Long story short, the factory became a reality. It's set up in this coastal Tamil Nadu town called Tuticorin, which has a reputation as an important maritime city because it has a port, but also it had pearl fisheries. It had the coral reefs of the Gulf of Mannar and a very important fishing economy. It had a very important salt economy. It had a very important farming economy and a very important trade economy because of the port. The factory locates itself over there, and as I said, copper smelters are dirty or polluting anywhere in the world. This copper smelter was located in close proximity to a very densely populated town, and so and also residential areas, and so people started suffering the effects of an ill-run copper smelter. And the protests against the copper smelter has not stopped for a single year since 1995, when the first foundation stone was laid. By 2018, of course, several attempts have been made to shut this factory down, and several times the factory had shut down, had been closed by court orders, or because it had disastrous gas leaks that hurt dozens of people, and in one instance in 2013, thousands of people. But every time the company was able to bounce back stronger. Because what people in India fight against when they're talking about environmental issues is you're not just fighting against the polluter, you're fighting against the colluders. And the colluders are the state government, the State Pollution Control Board, the Government of India, and all the other agencies, and of course, the entire industry of experts. These experts are sitting inside ivory tower institutions who will not open their mouths in support of ordinary people. And these experts are always looking out for, for consultancies, always feel scared. So these are experts without a spine. They're essentially people who have science degrees, but science degrees without a spine is as good as no degree, because then the only idea behind science is to speak truth. And that is often compromised because people are too scared to speak. So in 2018, things came to a head, and because the company was also planning to expand and construct another factory of the same size, and people gathered, they had a hunger strike, and the government attacked them and took the leaders away. This happened in January 2018, and took the leaders away and jailed them for a couple of days. Then they came out on bail. But this mobilized the people. They said, we are saying no to the existing factory, and you have the audacity to bring in a double the amount of copper production into an area that is already groaning under the burden of pollution. And so the town mobilized, also because the people who were involved in the who were jailed for this, there's a Professor Fatima Babu who was jailed for this, and she happened to have a very good reputation among the people, and the people mobilized, and things started getting hotter. On March 24th, there was a massive mobilization by people. It was a permitted event where police had given permission, and people came there, and it was like a carnival. It is just people happy that there are people around them, and we are protesting against something we do not want in our city, which is the Sterlite copper smelter plant. The government knew that they had a situation on their hands and that they had to do something about it. And so they did something, a very token gesture of saying we will not renew their license until they fulfill conditions. People would have none of it. They said close down the factory, close down the factory. On May 22nd, there was a massive rally, and that rally was supposed to go to the district collector's office, who is the chief executive of the city, and park out and camp out over there until the factory was shut down. This is a very important, and it is in the traditions of non-violent civil disobedience that people just gather there, they cook their food, they bring their children, and just live your life outside the collector's office for as long as it takes. This is something that has been celebrated around the world as a non-violent model, and this non-violent struggle was oppressed or repressed by the state, where they fired bullets into crowds of unknown people and ended up killing 14 people. But the violence that followed that was even more brutal. But yeah, that's in sum what happened on May 22nd in order to quell the protest. But what also happened out of that is that the factory was eventually shut down, and the government of Tamil Nadu and the chief environmental regulator acknowledged that the factory had operated in violation of environmental norms, had polluted the environment, had harmed the health of people, and was essentially a horrendous and notorious offender.
I just want to kind of bring in two audience questions at this moment. We have R. Kannan from Hague writing in. His question is about the Kodangolam issue. He asks if the mass FIRs and normalization of mass FIRs are in some ways what we led to the BK16 political prisoners now being picked up, the mass FIRs that are being now filed in the Delhi pogrom. The question that he's asking, I'll have to rephrase this. He's asking if you see a connection between what started with these to what is happening now. If someone had stepped in, and if there was more of a protest or an uproar when this happened, do you believe that what is happening today, to see the BK16 political prisoners or seeing the young students from the Shaheen Bagh protests being picked up?
It's very difficult to say whether these are things that could have been different if there had been very strong protest. There was very strong protest when the Kudangulam issue was happening. There was tremendous protest. There was a lot of outrage at the outrageous number of sedition FIRs and waging war against the state FIRs. And mind you, this was not Modi. This was Manmohan Singh. So let's not get confused about these things. I mean, these are people who are serving capital, and anything that disturbs capital will be dealt with iron gloves. And there was outrage. The issue of the filing of mass FIRs is not something that is new. The extent to which it was done is something that might be new. It will be done again, even if there's an immense, because you cannot outlaw the filing of mass FIRs. Because when you have a riot and the police sees that the riot has 3 or 4 known faces and about 40 other people who we don't know at the time of filing the FIR, I will say 4 people, known faces, plus 40 others. So this is something that the court or the assembly or the parliament cannot take away from the police, because it is assumed that the police will serve in public interest. The problem is the police don't serve in public interest. Not here, not in America, not in Canada, not in Spain. In most places, the police serves a very different interest. So then what do we do with it? The issue is, how do you bring accountability into the system? How do you ensure that the police works for people and not for corporations or their political masters? You have broken democracy. The United Nations is captured by corporations. America is captured by the Wall Street. India is captured by Dalal Street, or maybe 2 companies, 2 corporations. So when you have a breakdown in democracy, I don't think it is a matter of what is the modus operandi. They will do whatever is there in the books. It does not have to be legal. The state can break the law because you would have to go to court to challenge it, and the courts might already be stacked with people who will say what the state wants them to say. So you need to have a different way to approach the system. Yes, I think that pitched fights. Yeah, we will apply for bail. We will fight for our rights within this broken system. But you also need to think of ways in which you can start creating a new system. I don't think the system can be fixed. New systems will have to be brought.
And that brings us to the third of the case studies that we wanted to discuss today, which is the draft environmental impact assessment notification of the 2020. And about this, you write that the 2020 draft is merely the latest and the worst in a series of laws that view democracy and environmental protection as an impediment to the ease of doing business. Can you talk to us about the problems that you see within the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, and how, again, this kind of goes back into what you've already said about how big businesses play a role in weakening democracy, and also perhaps if you see if COVID having affected any kind of public resistance towards the EIA law.
Well, I'll take the last question first. That no, I think that thanks to young people, COVID actually allowed us to mobilize significantly without having to come out on the streets. And they showed us the way, and they are creative, and that's probably why the government is extremely scared of young people. Young people are not scared of the government. The government is scared. Mr. Modi is scared. Prakash Javadekar is scared. Amit Shah is terrified of young people. And I think that is why, if you want to put your weight behind anything, if you are an activist of any kind, put your weight behind young people. Ensure that there is sufficient free space for them to express themselves freely, for them to move around freely. Encourage your youth to get into activism and stand with them to ensure that the government does not brutalize them. EIA 2020. What is EIA? Environmental Impact Assessment. If I ask an indigenous person whose land is going to be mined about the environmental impact assessment, he will give it to you in 2 words or in a few lines. This happened in the case of, this is a very celebrated case. I think that there was this this movie that was made as well of these green people. I forget the name. The Vedanta, in Kalahandi, this company called Vedanta, which I just described, wanted to mine bauxite from a hill called Niyamgiri. And Niyamgiri as a hill is occupied and is peopled by this indigenous tribe called the Dongriya Khons. Dongriya is hills and Khons is the name of the tribe. And this is a very ancient Indian tribe, an Adivasi tribe. which means original people. And these people did not want to give up that hill because they consider it sacred. So Vedanta and the other people came and said, "We will build you a temple." They said that you cannot build us a temple because the hill is the temple. The entire hill is a temple, and the company wanted to lop off the top of the hill and take out the bauxite from that. And so there was a Adivasi elder, one called Lado Sikaka, who still is alive. In 2010, he was picked up and tortured. He was hung upside down and beaten up for saying he does not want to give up. He and his villagers, and this is a small village, we're talking about 150 people fighting against one of the world's largest corporations, the government of India, the government of Odisha. And he said these wise words, and he said that you remove the bauxite from the top of the hill, the 36 streams that feed the river Bamsadara will go dry. The bauxite will be over in 30 years, and you will never have water flowing through the river. So in his worldview, bauxite in the ground is prosperity. In our worldview, bauxite has to come out. And so we say, let us do an environmental impact assessment of bauxite extraction. Mr. Sikaka has already told you, you extract the bauxite, you will lose water forever. Your environmental impact assessment is done. Why do you need to employ engineers and scientists who have gone and spent a lot of money, probably burnt a hell of a lot of carbon, going to foreign countries to study, to come and do a study that this man has put in so succinctly? There are certain things that should not be done. This so environmental impact assessment notification has this as a fundamental flaw, that it assumes that many of these activities have manageable impacts. The second, it assumes that the science will be done with integrity. I've just explained to you that how can you have science with integrity when you have scientists without integrity? So you have EIA reports that are cooked up. I have just looked at one report which says that there are blue whales inside a creek north of Tamil Nadu, which has an average depth of about 0.7 meters, that's 700 centimeters. Sorry, 70 centimeters is the average depth. And that creek is supposed to have blue whales. So you have plagiarized content, you have very crappy science that passes off as science in these voluminous EIA reports. The third thing is that this aims to introduce public consultation, which I think is a very good thing. But public and consultation are two words that should not get together as far as the Indian bureaucracy is concerned. They like public to stay away and consultation to not happen. Because when they say public consultation, the single word that they use for it is called nuisance or a riot. And so there is no culture of democracy. We come from a feudal society. We are still a feudal society. We do not have the culture of democracy. It is not celebrated. It is not even acknowledged. You have a situation in this country now where we are celebrating a person who's got autocratic tendencies. We are celebrating the death of the constitution. And I think that is a huge problem to have. But then I think that the EI notification, when it brought in the public consultation, it is a good thing, because then public can say that this science is really bad. So we had situations where fisherfolk were taking on big scientists to say that your science is bad. But the EI notification itself was not meant to seek public consent. It was meant to have an iterative process for making the EIA better, and an environmental clearance, a license would be given at the end of it. Very few instances where the license has been rejected. The license will have about 40 or 50 conditions. So anytime if I say, why have you allowed this, it will have this impact, they say, don't worry about it. We have given them a condition that if they don't follow this condition, we will shut the factory down. How many factories have you shut down? Sterlite operated for 21 years and 14 people had to die before you shut them down. So the conditions are not enforced. So the point that I'm making is, we have a broken system. We have an environmental regulatory system that does not have enforcement. We have an environmentally regulatory system that does not have accountability. We have experts that do not have spine. These are things that need to be fixed if India has to address its environmental, which I when I say environmental, I'm saying its social needs.
We are already close to the last 1 hour mark. So I want to now talk about, you talked about young people and their activism. I want you to discuss the Disha Ravi's case as a jumping point to talk about young people in this country, their activism, but also the shrinking space for dissent.
So let me start this way. That as I said, there are two things that are broken. One is people's relationship with nature and people's relationship with people. Both are exploitative. Both have to be fixed. It is not enough to fix one because the other will pull you down and it will make it unworthy. So, in this case, the people's relationship with people is how you treat the people where you're extracting things from, how you treat the people that are adding value, which, we're talking about labor. So recently, what happened? There were two cases, and of course, environment and labor, both of them have to go together. And there were two cases. It's not just Disha Ravi. Disha Ravi is a well-known case because Disha Ravi is also part of Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, uh, who also tweeted this quote-unquote toolkit uh, that was implicated in the case, happens to be a celebrity. Disha's case is very well known. That does not make her any less deserving of our solidarity because there's absolutely no reason why she should have been picked up. But more than a month before she was picked up, there was this other young woman called Nodeep Kaur, who is part of the farmers' protest. And she comes from a disadvantaged community, a historically oppressed Dalit community, and she's a labor activist. The two things that need fixing is our relationship with people, which Nodeep was fighting for, and I'm sure she would have stood in solidarity with Disha, and our relationship with nature, which Disha was fighting for, and I'm sure she would stand in solidarity with Nodeep. Both these young women were brutally, and when I say brutal, I don't mean it doesn't have to be physical. The act of taking somebody when they have absolutely no right was, I think, the beginning of brutality. Both of them have been taken away. Nodeep has suffered very badly at the hands of the police. She has complained that she was sexually harassed. She was tortured in jail. She just got jailed. She just got bail today after spending more than a month in the hands of the biggest thugs in uniform. We had Disha Ravi, who was picked up from Bangalore, which is a southern city close to 1700 kilometers away from Delhi, by the Delhi police, out of jurisdiction. They just entered her home, picked her up, did not explain to any of her family members where she was being taken to. She was taken overnight, held overnight, and nearly 24 hours later, she was produced before a judge and charged with sedition. For what? She was part of a number of other people who collaborated, or I would say cooperated, in order to produce resources that you and I would think is ordinary. This is what you read to understand what the farm protest is about. This is what you read to understand what the other side thinks. These are all the different points of view. Here are all the people who are pushing for it. You can appeal to them by sending a petition. You can write to them. This is their address. This is their email address. This is what is called a toolkit. Everybody who's in activism or in campaigning or a politician knows what a toolkit is. We use it all the time, or in the corporate sector. And she was charged with sedition. And the Nodeep Kaur was also charged under extremely harsh charges, and both of them were jailed for. Disha Ravi was given 5 days of police custody, and that is like 5 days of hell. Delhi police are not pleasant people. Police are not pleasant people. And she was handed over to them. And this is a cooked up case, and they were finally released. And for what? These are people who are fighting for very ordinary things that the government of India, the Constitution of India guarantees. In fact, these are people that in any sane society, any mature democracy, we would be celebrating young people who are asking these kinds of questions because they are mature, they are non-violent, they are asking questions, fearlessly, and they're asking it very articulately. You'd be blessed to have children like that. But here we are jailing them and brutalizing them. I think the government of India has a lot to learn.
Thank you for that. I think it's actually important for us to articulate this in the public. I have another audience questions. This comes from Shelley Hellman in from upstate New York. She asks, could you please, first she says, thank you so much for the work you do. Please convey my immense respect to you and the young people that you work with. The world needs more of you. And after that, she follows up to say, can you talk to us about the ways in which the Indian state is cracking down on dissent, especially the acts of surveillance? I was reading about the work that you and your organization do. And is it true that you have been under surveillance? That many of the activists who work in Tamil Nadu, the state that you're from, are also under severe surveillance. Can you talk to us about the nature of surveillance, especially as targeted against activists in India?
So I'm a solidarity activist. So I'm not a grassroots activist in the front lines. I am two, three steps removed from them. So I have privilege, and I have the privilege of privilege and the privilege of distance. The Yes, there is surveillance, but it is not the surveillance of people like me that should matter. That should also matter. But I'm saying that if this is what is happening, where you have people like me being surveilled, you can imagine what it is in an invisible place like the tribal tracts of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, and Uttar Pradesh, and then the hill districts of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka. So the focus needs to be on the invisible places and the less visible people. Um, yes, surveillance is there. This is not an Indian phenomenon. If you challenge the state, you can be in any country in the world because all nations of the world are run by corporations. They are slaves to varying degrees. If you're from Northern Europe, they might probably be less slavish than North America or India. But India, America, Canada, Australia, we are cousins. We are all born, or we are all living inside a slave government mentality. Our governments don't belong to us. We are only required to elect them. We elect them to run the state. They run away with it. We watch it. We fight it, and we are brutalized. Ditto in Latin America. So I think that this democracy issue and is something that we need to be looking at in a nuanced manner. The democracy is always something that people want. The states don't want it. States always fight democracy. That's the way it's been. And I think that yes, there are good models for having more. It's an ideal. We might not reach there, but I do think that a lot of the European countries, Northern Europe, I don't mean to diss them completely. They've set in place systems. They have nurtured cultures that allow and celebrate public comment. So I've seen, in one instance in Netherlands, where they spent 5 years of consultation in order to carry out a project which was meant to reroute the river, where the river was straightened at one point of time, which was a very bad engineering idea. They decided to allow the river to flow once again. That meant disturbing people, but then they had to discuss and win over the people. And this process took 5 years. They put in the energy. I think that is great. I think that we can learn from such examples. And in places like India, if states can be, if politicians can understand that people are smarter or wiser, not smarter, are wiser than them, and if politicians and bureaucrats can have the humility, and if scientists can have the humility, then I think people will show them the way in which business can be done. Surveillance is a problem everywhere. I have never looked over my shoulder as much as I'm looking over now. 1999, 1998, we would do things, we had absolutely no worry because we are solidarity workers. Even then, the oppression was very, very heavy on frontline defenders. But as solidarity workers, we were sheltered. Now there is nobody who is safe.
Nobody is safe, and the way things are going, everybody might be very quickly silenced. We're almost, we're quite past the 1 hour mark. If you have a few more minutes, I have one last question. Can I have put one more question to you?
Sure.
The last question is about confronting the present. What we have is a dystopian nightmare. As you said, things are dire. What what ways do you think? I'm sure these are questions. These are questions that we think about at Polis Project every single day. But I was wondering, how do you think about this? What are the next steps? How do we fight? How do we forge forward? How do we soldier on?
So, one, I definitely don't see it in the same dystopic light. I'm a horrible optimist. Uh, I'm saying that, from these kinds of dystopic moments, you have people like Nodeep Kaur and Disha Ravi coming out, and more will come. There is no doubt about that. Will it be too late or not? That only an astrologer would be able to tell. The fight is still on. I think that means that the hope is still there. What do we need to do to strengthen our fight? First, I think we need to ensure that we don't get misled by this feeling that policy level changes will work. You need to strengthen the bottom. You need to so the job of an activist is to visibilize invisible places and people, and to give voice to things that don't have that voice or whose voice are not heard. There are three constituencies that are very important: people in the margins, non-human living beings, and the future generations. How do we make that voice the voice that decides elections? How do we impart to this? The changes that we need are not technological changes. We need cultural changes. And that cultural change also has to do with what we tell our children, what we tell our people as to what is valuable and what is of less value. Today, if I take a piece of land, the building that stands on that land is what is valued, not the open space around it. We don't value open, unbuilt spaces. The indigenous people value open, unbuilt spaces. The home is just a place to spend a few hours in. The health of the surrounding area is what matters. So, this is an open earth economy. What we have today as a dominant thinking or a dominant model is a paved earth economy. Open, unbuilt spaces is useless and valueless unless an oil pipeline runs through it, unless a highway runs through it, unless an industry stands on it, unless a township is built, or an urban sprawl, or a shopping mall, or a port, or an airport, or this or that. There is not much emphasis on how do we derive value by leaving land open and unbuilt, and probably by healing it. The new economy will depend on that. I don't think like the Green New Deal, you're going to have fast trains running on, wind power. That dream is not possible. Your earth doesn't have that. Your earth does not have it to sustain my lifestyle, which is the same as an average American's lifestyle. There just isn't enough. So bite the bullet. You're going to have to compromise on your lifestyle. You can phase it out, do it pleasantly, or you can have it done by nature, as the pandemic gave you a small hint. This is just the trailer. The main feature film is yet to come. You can prepare for that. And how do you prepare for that? Listen to the wise ones. Who are the wise ones? People in the unlikely places. Your younger generation. Listen to them. Listen to the farmers, the fisher folk. These people see things changing much earlier than you do. The language they speak is different from what you learn in MIT or IIT. Learn that language. Just as you would learn integral calculus, learn the language that ordinary people speak. And then I think that there would be a way to look out of this dystopia.
Nityanand Jayaraman, thank you so much for joining us today. Um, And again, thank you for reminding all of us, including myself, that hope is radical. For all of our audience who wrote in today and signed in, thank you so much. If you heard, listened, or engaged with the work we do consider supporting the Polis Project. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.